Arthur Art Reynolds had been arriving at Innovatech at 6:47 a.m. for the past 12 years. Not 6:45, not 7 o'clock, 6:47, because that gave him exactly 13 minutes to brew his coffee, check overnight system logs, and settle into the kind of focused quiet that disappeared once the younger engineers arrived with their energy drinks and collaborative chaos. At 55, Art understood that consistency was a form of craftsmanship. His corner office hadn't changed much since 2011. The same worn leather chair his wife had bought him for his 40th birthday, two 24-inch monitors displaying cascading lines of code that had been processing Innovatech's core operations for over a decade, and a coffee-stained mug that read "World's Most Adequate Developer," a gag gift from his team that had become his favorite piece of office equipment. The walls held certificates from a different era of technology. Advanced Systems Architecture, 1995, Federal Security Clearance, 1998, Database Optimization Specialist, 2003. Younger employees sometimes smirked at the dates, not understanding that these credentials represented battles fought in digital trenches they'd never seen, problems solved before Stack Overflow existed, systems built when failure meant starting over from handwritten backup notes. Art's flannel shirt, a rotation of 5 nearly identical blue and gray patterns, was as much a uniform as any corporate suit. While his colleagues had embraced the tech industry's casual dress code with expensive sneakers and startup hoodies, Art stuck to his flannel, worn jeans, and steel-toed boots. He looked more like a carpenter than a software engineer, which was exactly what he was, a digital craftsman who built things meant to last. His daily routine was methodical. First, the overnight logs, scanning for anomalies, performance degradation, unusual access patterns. His systems rarely threw errors, but when they did, Art wanted to know about it before anyone else. Then, a review of transaction processing metrics, $50 million daily, 200,000 active users, 0 data breaches in 12 years. These weren't just numbers to Art. They were proof that careful planning and conservative architecture choices paid dividends over time. The code itself was Art's real conversation partner. While other developers complained about legacy systems and technical debt, Art saw history in every function call, wisdom in every try-catch block. The authentication module he'd written in 2015 still handled user logins with military precision. The payment processing pipeline from 2017 had never dropped a transaction. The data backup protocols from 2019 had saved the company twice during hardware failures that would have crippled less prepared organizations. "Morning, Art," Sarah Martinez called out as she passed his office around 8:15. As Innovatech's security specialist, Sarah was one of the few people who truly understood what Art's systems did. She'd joined the company 5 years ago, fresh from a cybersecurity master's program, and had quickly learned that her textbook knowledge meant nothing without Art's institutional wisdom. "Sarah," Art nodded, looking up from a configuration file. "That new intrusion detection update you wanted to implement, I've got some concerns about the API compatibility." She paused in his doorway. "The vendor says it's fully backward compatible." "Vendor says a lot of things. Come take a look at this." Sarah pulled up a chair as Art walked through the integration points, showing her how the new system expected JSON responses while their legacy authentication layer used XML. It was a small incompatibility that the vendor sales team had glossed over, but one that could bring down user login during peak hours. "Jesus," Sarah muttered, scanning the code. "This would have taken the whole payment system offline." "For about 6 hours," Art agreed, "until we figured out why every transaction was failing." This was Art's value in a nutshell. Not just knowing how systems worked, but understanding how they failed. 27 years in the industry had taught him that the real skill wasn't writing code that worked when everything went right. It was building systems that degraded gracefully when everything went wrong. Tom Walsh from Infrastructure shared a similar appreciation for Art's work. A 15-year veteran himself, Tom understood that Innovatech's reliable uptime wasn't luck or modern cloud services. It was the result of Art's paranoid attention to failure modes, redundancy planning, and disaster recovery protocols that most companies skip to save time and money. The industry was changing around Art, and not always for the better. The arrival of Mark Davis as Chief Operating Officer in March had shifted Innovatech's cultural atmosphere in ways that made Art's stomach tighten with each passing week. Mark was 32, Harvard MBA, and carried himself with the kind of aggressive confidence that worked well in board presentations but poorly in technical discussions. He'd come from a series of successful exits, 3 startups sold for impressive multiples, each one after implementing what he called operational optimization through strategic modernization. His first all-hands meeting had been a masterclass in corporate buzzword deployment. We're going to leverage synergistic opportunities to disrupt our own operational paradigms while maintaining best-in-class customer experience metrics. Art had quietly translated this as, we're going to change things we don't understand to impress people who don't understand them either. Mark's office was a deliberate contrast to the rest of Innovatech's practical workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a standing desk made from reclaimed barnwood, and a wall-mounted monitor displaying real-time company metrics in colorful charts that looked impressive but measured the wrong things. While Art tracked system reliability and data integrity, Mark's dashboard showed user engagement rates and conversion funnel optimization, metrics that mattered to investors but said nothing about whether the underlying technology would still work tomorrow. The cultural shift was subtle but persistent. Long-term employees found themselves defending decisions they'd made years ago to people who'd been hired yesterday. Documentation that had been considered thorough was now insufficient for rapid scaling. Systems that had run without problems were technical debt that needed immediate modernization. Art watched these changes with the patience of someone who'd seen multiple waves of corporate transformation. He'd survived the dot-com boom, the social media revolution, the cloud migration frenzy, and the agile development craze. Each wave brought new terminologies and new consultants, but the fundamental challenges remained the same. Build systems that work, protect user data, process transactions accurately, and do it all reliably enough that people's lives weren't disrupted when they needed technology to work. But this wave felt different. Previous changes had been additive, new tools, new processes, new opportunities. Mark's transformation felt subtractive, as if experience itself had become a liability rather than an asset. The first real warning sign came during a technical architecture review in early May. Mark had assembled what he called a cross-functional optimization team to evaluate Innovatech's core systems for modernization opportunities. The team consisted of 2 junior developers hired within the past 6 months, a business analyst who'd never written a line of code, and Madison Lee, a bright 26-year-old engineer who'd impressed Mark with her enthusiasm for cloud-native solutions. Art had been invited to present his systems architecture, not as a participant in the planning process, but as a subject matter expert providing legacy context for the modernization roadmap. So this is our current authentication flow, Art began, projecting a diagram that showed the interactions between 17 different components. User credentials are validated through 3 layers of verification, with fallback protocols that ensure service availability even during database failures or network partitions. Madison raised her hand. Why 3 layers? Most modern auth services use single sign-on with JWT tokens. Because, Art replied patiently, single points of failure are exactly that, single points of failure. When your JWT service goes down, every user gets locked out simultaneously. When one of our 3 layers fails, the other 2 maintain service while we fix the problem. Mark leaned forward. But what's the performance impact of all this redundancy? Are we sacrificing user experience for theoretical reliability? It's not theoretical, Art said. We've had 7 major infrastructure events in the past 5 years. Each time, our users kept working while our competitors went offline. The performance impact is negligible, maybe 20 milliseconds of additional latency for the peace of mind that your customers can always access their accounts. The business analyst, a recent MBA graduate named Kevin, consulted his tablet. 20 milliseconds per transaction multiplied by our daily volume represents significant opportunity cost. If we could shave even 10 milliseconds off response times, we could potentially increase conversion rates by 0.3%. Art stared at Kevin for a moment, processing the absurdity of optimizing for theoretical conversion improvements while discussing the elimination of proven reliability measures. Kevin, what happens to conversion rates when your entire authentication system is offline? Well, that's a different kind of optimization problem. No, Art said firmly. It's the same problem. Reliability is user experience. When people can't access their accounts, they don't convert, they switch to competitors. Mark stepped in smoothly. Of course, reliability matters article. Nobody's questioning that. We're just exploring whether there are more efficient ways to achieve the same outcomes using modern tooling and contemporary best practices. This was how it always started, Art realized. Not with a direct attack on his work, but with a slow erosion of confidence disguised as progress. His systems weren't broken, they were inefficient. His approaches weren't wrong, they were outdated. His experience wasn't valuable, it was legacy thinking. Over the following weeks, Art watched the optimization team develop their modernization proposal. They recommended migrating authentication to a third-party service, replacing the custom payment processing pipeline with a vendor solution, and moving all data storage to a cloud provider that promised 9% uptime and enterprise-grade security. Art read through their proposal with growing concern. The third-party auth service had experienced 3 major outages in the past year. The payment vendor's security documentation mentioned nothing about PCI-compliant standards that Innovatech was legally required to maintain. The cloud migration plan assumed that data transfer could happen seamlessly, without accounting for the complex interdependencies between systems that had been developed over more than a decade. He compiled a risk assessment that outlined these concerns in detail, backing up each point with specific examples from industry outages, regulatory requirements, and Innovatech's own operational history. The document was 12 pages long and included appendices with technical specifications, compliance requirements, and detailed cost projections that showed how the proposed changes would increase operational expenses while reducing system reliability. Art submitted his risk assessment to Mark's team with a cover memo that concluded, "While modernization can provide significant benefits, the proposed changes would replace proven systems with unproven alternatives, increasing our risk profile while decreasing our operational control. I recommend a more gradual approach that allows us to test new solutions in parallel with existing systems before making wholesale replacements." Mark's response came back within 2 hours. "Thanks for the feedback, Art. The team will take your concerns into consideration as we finalize our recommendations." Art never heard anything more about his risk assessment. 3 weeks later, Mark announced the modernization timeline, full migration to the new architecture within 4 months, with Art's existing systems scheduled for decommissioning once the new solutions were operational. The email arrived at 8:23 a.m. on a Tuesday in late June, marked urgent with the kind of corporate speak that made Art's coffee taste bitter. Team alignment meeting. Conference room. B. 10 a.m. Subject: Organizational Optimization Initiative attendees: Mark Davis, COO, Jessica Walsh, HR, Director, David Kim, Legal Counsel, Arthur Reynolds. Art had seen this dance before. Optimization was corporate code for "we're about to destroy something we don't understand." The presence of HR and legal counsel meant the decision had already been made. This meeting was just procedural theater. He finished reviewing his morning logs, saved his current work, and walked to conference room B with the calm deliberation of someone who'd spent decades dealing with problems that other people created. Mark Davis sat at the head of the glossy conference table like he was delivering a TED Talk rather than ending a man's career. His perfectly pressed shirt and startup-approved sneakers screamed disruptor, and his vocabulary came straight from a business school buzzword generator. Jessica Walsh from HR offered a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. David Kim from legal looked uncomfortable, shuffling through papers with the demeanor of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Art," Mark said, not quite making eye contact, "thanks for joining us. I know you're busy, so we'll keep this brief." The thin folder on the table contained Art's termination papers, but Mark wouldn't use words like fired or laid off. Instead, he launched into a prepared speech that sounded like it had been focus grouped by corporate communications consultants. Innovatech is entering an exciting phase of growth and transformation. As we scale our operations and modernize our technical infrastructure, we're making some strategic adjustments to our team composition to better align with our forward-moving objectives. Art set down his coffee cup and waited. He'd learned long ago that the best way to handle corporate doublespeak was to let it exhaust itself. "Your contributions to Innovatech have been significant," Mark continued, consulting his notes as if he needed reminding of what Art had built. "The systems you've developed have served us well during our earlier growth phases. However, as we transition to more agile cloud-native solutions, we're finding that our technical leadership needs have evolved. Jessica Walsh leaned forward slightly. What Mark is saying, Arthur, is that your role is being restructured as part of our organizational modernization initiative. Restructured, Art repeated. Eliminated, David Kim clarified quietly, earning a sharp look from Mark. Mark recovered quickly. We're consolidating several technical roles into a more streamlined operational framework. Madison Lee will be assuming responsibility for system architecture and infrastructure management, working closely with our new cloud services partners to implement the modernization roadmap. Art felt something cold settle in his stomach. Madison was brilliant, enthusiastic, and completely unqualified to manage systems she'd never seen before. She'd been with the company for 8 months and had never worked on anything more complex than front-end user interfaces. Madison doesn't have security clearance for the payment processing systems, Art said. We're in the process of obtaining those clearances, Mark replied smoothly. In the meantime, our vendor partners will handle the technical implementation details. And the compliance certifications? The regulatory audits? The disaster recovery protocols? Mark waved dismissively. All of that will be managed through our cloud services contracts. That's the beauty of modern infrastructure. We don't need to reinvent the wheel when we can leverage best-in-class solutions from industry leaders. Art stared at Mark for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. They weren't just firing him. They were dismantling everything he'd built and replacing it with vendor solutions managed by people who didn't understand what they were managing. When? Art asked. Friday will be your last day, Jessica said, consulting her tablet. We'll handle all the transition documentation, of course. We understand you've accumulated significant institutional knowledge, so we'll want to make sure everything is properly documented for the handover. Art almost laughed. 12 years of institutional knowledge condensed into a handover document over 4 days. They might as well ask him to explain the theory of relativity in a text message. I'll need access to all the systems to properly document the handover procedures, Art said. Mark exchanged a glance with Jessica. We've already arranged for Madison to shadow you during the transition period. She can handle the technical documentation while you provide the high-level overview. Madison doesn't have access to half the systems she'd need to document. We'll arrange temporary access as needed. Art understood. They wanted him to train his replacement while simultaneously ensuring he couldn't do anything that might complicate their timeline. It was like asking an architect to explain how to maintain a building to someone who'd never seen the blueprints. Is there anything else? Art asked. Mark smiled his practiced smile. I want you to know this isn't personal, Art. You've been a valuable contributor, and we wish you the best in your future endeavors. The industry is evolving rapidly, and sometimes organizations need to evolve with it. Art stood up slowly, his mind already shifting into the systematic problem-solving mode that had served him well for 27 years. They thought they were eliminating a legacy employee, but they were actually creating a legacy problem, one that would compound with interest until it reached critical mass. I understand, Art said simply. I'll make sure everything is properly documented. Over the next 4 days, Art methodically implemented what he privately called knowledge archaeology. Every system he'd built over 12 years contained layers of institutional wisdom that couldn't be transferred through documentation alone. These weren't malicious backdoors or sabotage measures. They were the accumulated solutions to problems that would only become apparent when the original architect was no longer available to explain them. The authentication system, for example, included a secondary validation routine that activated during high traffic periods. This wasn't documented in the standard technical specifications because it had been added during an emergency patch 3 years ago when a DDoS attack had overwhelmed their primary servers. The code was buried in a configuration file that loaded only when certain traffic thresholds were exceeded, and it referenced encryption keys stored in a database table that looked like leftover test data. Art relocated the documentation for this failsafe to a directory labeled archived_testing_protocols and renamed the relevant files with generic timestamps. Anyone looking for disaster recovery procedures would find the standard documentation, but they wouldn't find the information needed to understand why their system was rejecting legitimate user logins during peak traffic periods. The payment processing pipeline contained similar layers of accumulated wisdom. Over the years, Art had identified 17 different ways that transaction processing could fail due to network latency, database locks, or third-party service timeouts. Each failure mode had its own recovery procedure, and each recovery procedure was documented in a different location depending on when it had been developed and which team member had originally reported the problem. Art consolidated all of this documentation into a single encrypted archive, which he labeled legacy_compliance_documentation, and stored in a directory that looked like old backup files. The encryption key was a 40-character string that followed a pattern only Art would recognize. The first letter of each month from his start date at Innovatech, combined with the ASCII values of his daughter's initials, multiplied by his employee ID number. The most critical piece of knowledge archaeology involved the federal compliance protocols. Innovatech processed payments for healthcare organizations, which meant they were subject to HIPAA regulations, PCI compliance standards, and financial industry oversight requirements. Art had spent 2 years working with federal auditors to develop certification procedures that satisfied all 3 regulatory frameworks simultaneously. On Wednesday afternoon, Sarah Martinez stopped by his office with a cup of coffee and the kind of carefully neutral expression that meant she wanted to say something she couldn't officially say. "Heard about Friday," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Word travels fast. Madison asked me to explain the intrusion detection protocols to her yesterday. She seemed overwhelmed." Art glanced up from the configuration file he was reviewing. "It's a complex system. She didn't understand why we have 17 different alert thresholds. When I tried to explain the difference between reconnaissance scanning and actual penetration attempts, she asked if we could just set everything to high sensitivity and let the AI sort it out." Art winced. Intrusion detection was as much art as science, requiring human judgment to distinguish between suspicious patterns and normal variations in user behavior. Setting all alerts to high sensitivity would generate thousands of false positives daily, effectively disabling the system by overwhelming operators with noise. "What did you tell her?" "That she should probably talk to you before making any changes to the current setup." "Good advice." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "Art, what happens if they actually go through with this modernization plan? I mean, what happens when something breaks and nobody knows how to fix it?" Art saved his work and turned to face her directly. "That depends on how badly they break it and how quickly they realize they've broken it." "That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be." Art pulled up a network diagram that showed the interconnections between Innovatech's various systems. "Look at this. 17 different services, 43 integration points, 12 external dependencies, and 5 regulatory compliance frameworks." Madison sees this and thinks legacy complexity. "I see it and think battle-tested reliability." Sarah studied the diagram. "How long would it take to rebuild this from scratch? With proper planning, adequate funding, and experienced architects? 18 months, minimum. With Mark's timeline and Madison's current knowledge level?" Art shrugged. "Could be years, assuming they survive the first major security incident." "Jesus." "The irony," Art continued, "is that they think they're reducing complexity by moving to cloud services. But they're not eliminating complexity. They're just moving it somewhere else and paying someone else to manage it. The problem is, when that external complexity fails, they'll have no way to fix it themselves." Sarah finished her coffee and stood to leave. "For what it's worth, I think this is insane. You're the most competent person in this building, and they're throwing you away because you don't use the right buzzwords." After she left, Art returned to his knowledge archaeology work. He was documenting the disaster recovery procedures when Tom Walsh appeared in his doorway. "Got a minute?" Tom asked. "Sure." Tom closed the door behind him, which was unusual. In 12 years, Art couldn't remember Tom ever closing his office door for a conversation. "I wanted to give you this before Friday," Tom said, handing Art a business card. "It's for a consulting firm called Sentinel Solutions. They specialize in cybersecurity and infrastructure architecture for mid-size companies." Art examined the card. The logo was simple and professional, and the company name suggested exactly the kind of work Art had been doing at Innovatech, protecting valuable systems from people who didn't understand their value. "Know someone there?" Art asked. "The CTO is Mike Thompson. No relation to Mark, thank God. Mike and I worked together about 6 years ago at a financial services company. Good guy. Understands the value of experience. Hires people who actually know what they're doing instead of people who just interview well." Tom sat down and lowered his voice. "I gave Mike a call yesterday, told him about your situation. He's interested in talking to you. They've got a couple of clients who need exactly your kind of expertise. Companies that grew fast on modern platforms but are starting to hit the reliability problems that come with scale." "Sounds interesting." Mike said something that I thought you'd appreciate. We don't fix things that aren't broken, but we do fix things that are breaking. Their whole business model is helping companies avoid the kind of disasters that Mark is about to create here. Art pocketed the business card. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate the referral. There's something else, Tom said, glancing toward the door. Mike mentioned that Sentinel has been getting a lot of calls lately from companies that tried to modernize too quickly and ended up in trouble. Apparently, there's a whole market developing around cleaning up failed cloud migrations and vendor integration disasters. Not surprising. The point is, you might not be out of work very long. And when Innovatech eventually needs help fixing whatever Mark breaks, you'll be in a position to choose whether you want to help them or not. Mike Thompson called Art that afternoon. They talked for 20 minutes about sustainable modernization, the difference between innovation and destruction, and the value of experience in an industry obsessed with youth. By Thursday afternoon, Art had accepted Sentinel's offer as a senior systems architect starting the following Monday, 30% more than his current salary. On Friday morning, Art arrived at 6:47 a.m. for the last time. He spent the morning with Madison, explaining backup systems, regulatory requirements, and the difference between redundancy and reliability. Madison took notes diligently, but Art could see her struggling to understand why simple solutions weren't always better solutions. Mark wants me to start implementing the cloud migration next week, Madison said near the end of their meeting. He says we can't afford to wait months learning all the details of the old systems when the new systems are designed to be simpler and more reliable. Art felt that familiar chill. Madison, these systems process $50 million in transactions every day. Simple and reliable aren't the same thing, and reliability takes time to prove. But the vendor guarantees 99.9% uptime. Guarantees are marketing promises. When the system goes down, not if, when, the vendor will apologize and maybe refund your service fees. But they won't compensate you for the business you lose or the customers who stop trusting you. Madison looked uncomfortable. Mark says you tend to be overly cautious about change. Art nodded slowly. Madison, I want you to remember this conversation. In 6 months, when something breaks and you can't figure out why, I want you to remember that being cautious about change isn't the same thing as being afraid of progress. At 5 p.m., Art packed his personal items into a single cardboard box and walked toward the elevator. As the doors closed, he realized he felt lighter than he had in months. For the first time in years, he was walking away from a job instead of being pushed out of one. The attack came 11 days after Art left Innovatech. It started as a distributed denial-of-service assault that should have been easily deflected by Innovatech's security infrastructure. But the new cloud-based protection service had been configured incorrectly, and the traditional fallback protocols had been optimized out of existence. Madison had spent her first week implementing Mark's cloud migration plan, which included replacing the overly complex intrusion detection protocols with a vendor-managed security service that promised AI-powered threat analysis and zero configuration protection. The new service was certainly simpler than Art's system. Instead of 17 different alert thresholds calibrated to Innovatech's specific traffic patterns, it had 3 settings: low, medium, and high. Madison had set it to medium, which the vendor described as appropriate for most business environments. At 9:23 a.m., the authentication traffic spiked beyond what any legitimate user base could generate. The AI-powered threat analysis system noted the increase, but categorized it as possibly suspicious rather than definitely malicious, which meant it logged the event but didn't trigger any alerts. The system had been trained on generic attack patterns, not the specific vulnerabilities of hastily migrated legacy systems. By 10:15 a.m., the attackers had identified 3 separate vulnerabilities in Innovatech's new cloud-based authentication service. The first was a timing attack that revealed whether user accounts existed by measuring response delays. The second was a token validation flaw that allowed attackers to extend session timeouts indefinitely. The third was a privilege escalation bug that let authenticated users access administrative functions. Under Art's architecture, any one of these vulnerabilities would have been contained by secondary security layers. The timing attack would have been masked by randomized response delays. The token validation flaw would have been caught by independent session monitoring. The privilege escalation would have been blocked by role-based access controls that operated separately from the primary authentication system. But those secondary layers had been eliminated during the modernization process. Mark's team had viewed them as redundant complexity and technical debt that increased maintenance overhead without providing measurable value. Madison was in a meeting with Mark when the first alert started appearing on her dashboard. The vendor's AI system had finally classified the attack as definitely malicious, but by then the attackers had already compromised 47 users' accounts and were using those credentials to access customer financial data. "What exactly are we looking at?" Mark asked, staring at the red warning indicators spreading across Madison's monitor. I think we're being hacked," Madison replied, her voice tight with stress. Mark leaned closer to the screen. "Can you stop it?" Madison clicked through the vendor's management interface, looking for an emergency response option. The system offered several choices: increase security level, enable enhanced monitoring, and contact support for assistance. She clicked Increase Security Level, which immediately blocked all authentication requests, including legitimate users who were trying to log in. The attack stopped, but so did all customer access to their accounts. Innovatech's payment processing ground to a halt, and customer service phones began ringing with complaints from users who couldn't complete transactions. "That's not good," Mark muttered. Madison tried Enable Enhanced Monitoring, which generated a flood of alerts about suspicious activity that had already occurred. The system helpfully informed her that 2,847 anomalous authentication attempts had been detected in the past hour, but it didn't explain which attempts were from attackers and which were from legitimate users being blocked by the increased security level. Contact Support for Assistance opened a chat window with an automated assistant that asked Madison to describe her problem in detail and estimate the business impact on a scale of 1 to 10. While Mark called vendor emergency support, the attackers switched tactics. Instead of attacking the authentication system directly, they began targeting the cloud storage service that housed Innovatech's customer database. The storage service used a different security model than ART's original system, relying on API keys and access tokens that could be compromised through credential stuffing attacks. Madison's phone started buzzing with alerts from the cloud storage vendor. Customer data was being downloaded in bulk, and the automated threat detection system couldn't distinguish between legitimate backup operations and malicious data exfiltration. "Jesus Christ," Madison whispered, reading the alerts. "They're downloading our customer database." Mark grabbed the phone and read over her shoulder. "How much data?" "All of it. Names, addresses, payment information, account balances, everything." "Can we stop it?" Madison tried to revoke the API keys, but the system informed her that doing so would also block legitimate application access to the database. Every transaction, every account lookup, every payment verification request required those same API keys. Revoking them would shut down Innovatech's entire operation. "We can't stop the download without stopping everything else," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. By 1:30 p.m., it was clear that Innovatech was facing a complete catastrophe. Customer data was being sold on dark web marketplaces with timestamps from that morning. Social media filled with angry customers posting screenshots of their personal information being auctioned to the highest bidder. Local news stations were already running stories about the breach. Madison called Art. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. Arthur Reynolds. "Art, this is Madison. We need help. There's been a security breach, and Madison, slow down." "What kind of breach?" Madison explained the situation in halting, technical fragments: the authentication compromise, the failed vendor response, the customer data exfiltration, the complete inability to stop the attack without shutting down their entire system. Art listened without interrupting. When Madison finished, there was a long pause. "How much customer data was compromised?" he asked finally. "All of it. Everything in the primary database." Another pause. "Have you contacted law enforcement?" "Not yet. Mark wanted to try to contain it first." "Madison, you can't contain this. You need to start damage control immediately. Contact the FBI's cybercrime unit, notify your legal team, and prepare breach notifications for every affected customer." "Art, please, can you help us? I know this was our mistake, but our customers don't deserve to suffer because we made bad decisions." Art was quiet for nearly 30 seconds. Madison could hear traffic noise in the background, as if he was walking somewhere. "Madison, I can't come back to Innovatech, but I can send you something that might help with the immediate crisis." "Anything, please. I'm going to email you a recovery package. It contains the original security protocols and emergency response procedures. The documentation is comprehensive, but implementing it will require someone who understands system architecture at a fundamental level. I'll figure it out." Madison, Art's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't a matter of figuring it out. You need expert help, and you need it immediately. The recovery package will stop the bleeding, but rebuilding your security infrastructure will take months of work by experienced professionals. After Art hung up, Madison waited by her computer for his email. When it arrived 15 minutes later, the subject line was simple: Emergency Recovery Protocols. Handle with care. The email contained a compressed archive with the most comprehensive technical documentation Madison had ever seen. Art had organized everything by priority: immediate threat response, system isolation procedures, data forensics protocols, customer notification templates, regulatory compliance checklists, and long-term recovery planning. But as Madison read through the documentation, she realized that Art had been right. Understanding what to do was very different from understanding why to do it. The procedures were precise and comprehensive, but they assumed a level of system knowledge that Madison simply didn't possess. Working with Tom Walsh, they managed to implement several of Art's emergency protocols and contain the immediate data exfiltration. But customer access remained completely blocked, and the full scope of the breach was still unknown. The emergency board meeting was swift and merciless. CEO David Park sat at the head of the table, flanked by legal counsel and the CFO. Mark entered with a prepared presentation, but David raised a hand before Mark could open his laptop. "Just tell me what happened," David said. Mark explained the security breach in corporate terms that minimized his responsibility while emphasizing the unprecedented sophistication of the attack and the limitations of current industry security standards. He described the incident as an unavoidable consequence of operating in a challenging threat environment rather than the predictable result of eliminating proven security measures. Legal counsel interrupted after 5 minutes. "Mark, how much customer data was compromised?" "We're still determining the full scope, but we believe the attackers may have accessed some personally identifiable information." "How much is some?" Mark glanced at his notes. "Potentially all customer records in our primary database." The room went silent. CFO Patricia Williams was the first to speak. "Mark, are you telling us that every customer's personal and financial information was stolen?" "We believe the data may have been accessed, but we're not certain it was actually exfiltrated." David Park leaned forward. "Mark, I've been getting calls for the past 3 hours from customers who say their information is being sold online." "It was exfiltrated." Legal counsel pulled up something on his tablet. "We have federal notification requirements that are triggered immediately upon discovery of a breach this size. We need to notify the FTC within 72 hours, and we need to send individual notifications to every affected customer within 60 days. "What kind of penalties are we looking at?" David asked. "For a breach this size, potentially millions in fines. Plus the costs of credit monitoring for affected customers, legal fees for the inevitable class action lawsuits, and regulatory compliance costs that could continue for years." Patricia Williams consulted her own tablet. "What about the operational impact? How long before we can restore customer access?" Mark looked uncomfortable. "We're working on that. Madison and Tom are implementing recovery procedures, but it may take several days to fully restore functionality." "Several days?" David's voice rose. "Mark, we process $50 million in transactions daily. Every day we're offline costs us direct revenue plus customer trust that we may never recover." David stood up and walked to the window. "Mark, walk me through the decision-making process that led to this situation." Mark opened his laptop and projected his modernization presentation from 3 months earlier. The goal was to reduce technical debt and operational complexity by migrating to modern cloud-based solutions that would be more cost-effective and easier to maintain. "What about the security implications?" The vendor assured us that their security model was superior to our legacy systems. Legal counsel looked up from his tablet. "Do we have documentation of those assurances?" They were part of the sales presentations and contract negotiations. "Mark, I need you to understand something," legal counsel said carefully. "Vendor assurances are not a legal defense. If we made decisions that a reasonable professional would consider negligent, we can be held liable regardless of what vendors promised." David returned to his seat. "Who was responsible for evaluating the security implications of this migration?" Mark hesitated. "The evaluation was a collaborative process involving multiple stakeholders. Who was the senior technical authority on security architecture?" "We consulted with several experts during the planning process." "Mark," David's voice was dangerously quiet, "who was the most qualified person in this company to evaluate the security implications of replacing our authentication and data protection systems?" Mark stared at his presentation for a long moment. "Arthur Reynolds, And what was Arthur's assessment of the migration plan? He had concerns about some of the implementation details. What kind of concerns? Mark pulled up another file on his laptop. He submitted a risk assessment that outlined potential issues with vendor reliability, regulatory compliance, and system integration complexity. And what did you do with that assessment? We considered his feedback during the final planning stages. David held out his hand. I want to see Arthur's risk assessment. Mark forwarded the 12-page document that Art had submitted 3 months earlier. David read it in silence, occasionally highlighting sections with his finger. The room remained quiet, except for the sound of traffic 20 floors below. After 10 minutes, David closed his tablet and looked directly at Mark. According to this document, Arthur predicted almost exactly what happened today. He warned that vendor security solutions were less reliable than proven internal systems. He identified specific regulatory compliance risks. He recommended parallel testing before migration, and he suggested maintaining legacy systems as fallbacks during the transition period. Yes, but, Mark, Arthur wrote that eliminating redundant security layers would create single points of failure that could bring down our entire operation. He wrote that vendor security promises should be verified through independent testing rather than accepted at face value. He wrote that rapid migration timelines would increase the likelihood of configuration errors and integration failures. David stood up again. Mark, this document reads like a prediction of today's disaster, written 3 months in advance, and your response was to fire the person who wrote it. David, Arthur was resistant to change. His approach would have delayed modernization indefinitely. His approach, David said coldly, would have prevented the most serious security incident in our company's history. The meeting concluded with assignments and Mark's effective demotion. Legal counsel was tasked with contacting Art through Sentinel Solutions to request emergency consulting assistance. Art received the call from Innovatech's legal counsel at 6:15 p.m., just as he was finishing his first day at Sentinel Solutions. Mike Thompson had given him a quiet office overlooking Elliott Bay, and Art had spent the day reviewing technical documentation for 3 clients' companies that were planning infrastructure modernization projects. Mr. Reynolds, this is James Morrison from Innovatech's legal department. I'm calling to request emergency consulting assistance for a significant security incident. Art set down the technical specification he'd been reading. What kind of incident? Complete compromise of our customer database with confirmed data exfiltration. Our current team is unable to restore secure operations, and we're facing federal notification requirements with substantial financial penalties. Art was quiet for a moment. James, I think you should know that I'm no longer available for Innovatech consulting work. Mr. Reynolds, I understand the circumstances of your departure from the company. But we're dealing with a crisis that affects hundreds of thousands of customers, and you may be the only person with the expertise needed to minimize the damage. Art walked to his office window and looked out at the Seattle waterfront. What about Madison and the vendor support team? Madison is doing her best, but she's overwhelmed by the complexity of the systems involved. The vendor support team has been unable to provide solutions that don't require shutting down our entire operation. Art found Mike Thompson in his office and explained the situation. Mike listened thoughtfully, then said, "This is your decision, Art. We don't need the revenue, and I wouldn't want you to feel obligated to help people who treated you poorly." "It's not about them," Art said. "It's about the customers whose data was compromised, and the employees who are dealing with the consequences of decisions they didn't make." Mike nodded. "I'll call their legal department and work out a formal consulting agreement. You focus on the technical response." Art returned to Innovatech's offices at 8:30 p.m., carrying his laptop and a box of technical documentation he'd retrieved from his secure archive. The building was nearly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of IT staff working on the crisis response. Madison met him in the lobby, looking exhausted and grateful. "Art, thank you for coming. I know this is awkward, but we really need your help." Art spent the next 18 hours guiding the Innovatech team through comprehensive system recovery. They built parallel authentication servers using backup hardware from the old data center. They restored encrypted customer data from secure archives that predated the compromise. They implemented monitoring systems that could detect intrusion attempts while maintaining performance levels necessary for normal business operations. The work was exhausting but satisfying. Art was doing what he did best, solving complex technical problems under pressure, protecting systems and data that other people depended on, and teaching younger engineers how to think about technology in terms of reliability and security rather than just functionality and features. Madison proved to be a capable student when she wasn't being pressured to implement changes she didn't understand. "Art," she said during a break at 3 a.m., "I owe you an apology. When Mark was pushing the modernization plan, I thought your systems were unnecessarily complex. But now I understand that the complexity was intentional. You were planning for failures that the rest of us couldn't imagine." "The best security architecture," Art replied, "assumes that everything will eventually fail and plans accordingly." By Friday evening, they had restored basic customer access and implemented monitoring systems that would detect any residual compromise. The immediate crisis was over, but the long-term consequences were just beginning. The aftermath unfolded over the following months like a slow-motion avalanche. The regulatory investigations began within a week. The Federal Trade Commission opened a formal inquiry into Innovatech's data protection practices. The Department of Health and Human Services initiated a HIPAA compliance review. 3 state attorneys general announced investigations into potential violations of state privacy laws. The financial impact was staggering. Direct costs for credit monitoring services, legal fees, and regulatory fines exceeded $8 million within the first quarter. Indirect costs from lost customers, delayed projects, and reputation damage were harder to quantify but clearly much larger. Mark Davis's departure was announced 3 weeks after the incident, described in corporate communications as a mutual decision to pursue opportunities better aligned with his long-term career objectives. Industry observers understood this as a face-saving termination, and Mark's LinkedIn profile remained unchanged for months afterward, a digital monument to a career derailed by hubris and poor judgment. Madison Lee survived the corporate restructuring and was eventually promoted to senior systems engineer under the mentorship of Tom Walsh, who became Innovatech's new chief technology officer. She enrolled in cybersecurity certification courses and began developing the kind of patient, systematic approach to infrastructure management that Art had tried to teach her during their brief handover period. Art's own career trajectory proved the value of experience in an industry obsessed with youth. Sentinel Solutions promoted him to principal architect within 6 months, and his client list grew to include several Fortune 500 companies that needed help cleaning up failed modernization projects. The demand for Art's expertise reflected a broader industry trend, the recognition that moving fast and breaking things worked for consumer applications, but catastrophically failed for enterprise systems that handled sensitive data and critical transactions. Companies were learning that the most expensive technical debt wasn't old code, it was new code that had been implemented without understanding why the old code existed. Art began speaking at cybersecurity conferences, not as a vendor promoting new solutions, but as a practitioner explaining how to evaluate security claims and implement changes without destroying existing protections. His presentations drew standing ovations from audiences of experienced engineers who had watched too many competent colleagues get replaced by confident incompetence. 1 year after leaving Innovatech, Art received an unexpected invitation. The company's new leadership wanted him to speak at their annual technology conference about lessons learned from the security incident. The irony was perfect. They wanted the person they had fired for being outdated to explain to their current staff why experience and careful planning were essential for reliable systems. Art accepted the invitation. His presentation was titled "The Hidden Cost of Technical Shortcuts," and he delivered it to an audience that included several former colleagues, industry analysts, and technology journalists who had covered Innovatech's security incident. Art didn't mention Mark by name or criticize specific decisions. He simply explained how systems fail when the people managing them don't understand the problems those systems were designed to solve. The most powerful moment came during the question and answer session, when a young engineer asked how to evaluate whether a modernization project was worth the associated risks. "Ask yourself," Art replied, "whether you understand the current system well enough to rebuild it if the new system fails. If the answer is no, then you're not modernizing, you're gambling with other people's data." 3 years after leaving Innovatech, Art was recognized by the Information Security Professional Association as their Practitioner of the Year, an award that honored cybersecurity professionals who had made significant contributions to industry best practices. The award citation specifically mentioned his work in demonstrating the critical importance of institutional knowledge and systematic risk assessment in enterprise security architecture. In his acceptance speech, Art talked about the responsibility that experienced professionals had to share their knowledge, even when that knowledge wasn't fashionable or profitable. He talked about the difference between innovation and destruction, between progress and change for its own sake. The best legacy any engineer can leave, Art concluded, isn't the code they wrote or the systems they built. It's the knowledge they shared and the disasters they prevented by helping others understand that moving fast and breaking things is a luxury we can't afford when other people's livelihoods and privacy are at stake. 5 years after the Innovatech incident, Art sat in his home office in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, putting the finishing touches on his second book. Through his window, he could see the city skyline and the sound beyond, where ferries carried commuters who trusted that the systems managing their tickets, their routes, and their safety would work reliably every day. His phone buzzed with a text message from Madison Lee, who had become one of his most successful protégés. She was now the CTO of a financial services startup that was building payment processing systems for small businesses. Art wanted to let you know we just passed our first federal security audit with 0 findings. The auditors specifically noted the exceptional architectural foresight of our core systems. Thank you for teaching me to build things the right way. Art smiled and went back to his writing. The chapter he was working on was about the relationship between trust and technology, how systems earn trust by working reliably over time, and how that trust can be destroyed in minutes by people who don't understand what they're breaking. The legacy systems at Innovatech still ran Art's original code, updated and maintained but built on the foundation he had designed more than a decade earlier. They processed millions of transactions, protected hundreds of thousands of customer records, and proved every day that the most valuable technology wasn't the newest or the flashiest, it was the most reliable. And in server rooms across the country, other engineers like Art continued building systems designed to last, one careful line of code at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and leave a comment to let me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get notified about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.